La classe operaia accompagna l'attacco, Stato e padroni non la possono fermare, niente operai pur di più a lavorare.
What Vermont city was a hotbed of revolutionary socialism and anarchism in the early 1900s? If you guessed Barre, you'd be correct. Barre is located in central Vermont, not far from the state capital, Montpelier, and with a population of 8,700. And for a time in the early 1900s, it was an internationally known center of Italian-American radicalism. Barre today is in central Vermont. It's a sister city to Montpelier. Montpelier is largely a white-collar city. Insurance industry is big there, as well as state government. It's traditionally a hippie town. Several generations of counterculturally oriented people have located there throughout the last several decades. Barre, which is about 5 to 7 miles away, is blue collar, and of course the granite industry is big there, as well as manufacturing, light manufacturing, things like that. Barre was founded in 1788 as a farming community and named after Isaac Barre, who was a British politician who was sympathetic to the American colonies in the period leading up to the Revolutionary War. Vermont is unfortunately known for poor soil. It's very rocky, not very difficult, cold climate, not good growing place, making farming difficult, and the first generation of settlers eventually moved away. Granite deposits were discovered in Barre shortly after the War of 1812, and the first granite quarry was opened in 1813. Unfortunately, since Vermont is very rocky, difficult terrain, very hilly, a mountainous area, it's very hard to get the granite out of Vermont. So it wasn't until Central Vermont Railroad built a spur into Barre in 1875 that the granite industry really took off. Large numbers of immigrants, mostly skilled granite quarry workers and stone cutters, began arriving in 1880, and the population of Barre rose from 2,000 in the 1870s to 12,000 in 1910. Skilled stone cutters and quarry workers originally came from Scotland, then Spain, and later predominantly from northern Italy. By 1910, Italians had supplanted the Scottish as the largest immigrant community in Barre, and by 1914, 1/4 of Barre's population was Italian, making Barre Vermont's foremost ethnically mixed blue-collar city. The Italian immigrants who came to work in Barre differed from those from southern Italy, who settled in other regions of the U.S., who were generally from a peasant background and were less likely to be literate. Barre granite workers were generally literate, had often traveled or lived in other parts of Europe connected to the granite industry, stone industry, such as Spain, France, and Russia. They often had connections with radical politics in those countries and in Italy, and were often very hostile to the Catholic Church, which they saw as supporting the large landowners and the corrupt status quo in Italy. After the reunification of Italy, what was called the Risorgimento in 1871, stone quarries in northern Italy began shutting down due to foreign competition, creating mass unemployment. This was blamed by many workers on Italy's recent reunification and encouraged mass immigration. Italian immigrants brought radical traditions with them to Barre. According to an interview by the oral historian Robert Galleani with an old-time granite worker in Vermont's Untold Story, about a dozen members of one of Garibaldi's expeditionary forces settled in Barre, as did followers of the Italian revolutionary Mazzini. By 1905, Barre had about 2,000 granite workers, with about 1,400 of them skilled stonecutters. With a blue-collar, working-class majority and a large immigrant population, Barre was typical of late 19th, early 20th century U.S. cities. However, the fact that Barre had become the world's largest supplier of granite made the city unusual, with Barre having a monopoly on granite production. Its workers, after much struggle, were able to win victories and higher wage rates than workers elsewhere in the U.S. Horrible conditions. Conditions for Barre's granite workers were horrific and far worse than those of granite workers in Europe. Granite contains much higher levels of deadly silica fibers than marble, which most stonecutters had previously worked on in Italy, and stoneworkers in the U.S. worked in indoor, confined spaces different from the practice in Europe. Stonecutters often work also without filters, so silicosis, which is a respiratory disease, excuse me, which is often been called stonecutters tuberculosis, was very common, leading to health problems and a high death toll among workers. In 1900, the average life expectancy in the U.S. was 50. In Barre, it was 42. According to Solid Men in the Granite City, a history in the history of municipal socialism in Barre, Vermont, 1916 and 1831, by Robert Weir, Vermont stonecutters had a 33% higher mortality rate than the U.S. as a whole. Well into the 1940s, and conditions in the industry only improved with the passage of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in 1970. Weir cites oral histories and personal letters showing that the stone cutting industry was considered a killer. Weir quotes a longtime granite worker, Raoldus Richmond, as saying, "I cut stone all my life and drank all my life. Both will kill a man in his 40s. Union militancy. A small granite strike in 1903 was followed by a bigger strike in 1904, when 3,000 workers were locked out in response to a tool sharpeners strike. 4,500 workers went on strike in 1908, and there were walkouts in 1909, 1910, 1915, 1922, 1933, and 1938. A big labor action occurred in 1922 when workers walked out in reaction to Barre businesses attempting to impose the anti-union, quote, American plan on employees. From 1900 to 1917, when union membership in the U.S. was no more than 7%, about 90% of Barre's workers belonged to unions. While Barre workers belonged to a variety of unions, the two dominant unions during the early 20th century was the Moderate Granite Cutters International Association, CCIA, which was affiliated with the AFL, and the more radical Quarry Workers International Union, QWIU. The QWIU, which was headquartered in Barre, had at one time been a part of the Socialist Labor Party, then affiliated with the IWW, and although eventually joined the AFL, it remained dominated by anarchists who frequently clashed with the AFL. The granite industry was divided into two sectors, quarrying and the more skilled finishing work. In Barre, the industry was not dominated by large monopolies and trusts, as was much of late 19th century industry, but rather by dozens of relatively small-scale quarries and shops, many of which had been started by former workers in the industry. The largest firm in the early 1900s employed 500 workers, and the next two firms employed 60 workers and 25 workers, respectively. Robert Weir in Solid Men in the Granite City said, experienced cutters could make about $2.50 a day and often felt closer to so-called self-made employers than they did with the more elite carvers and finishers who earned twice that amount, a high wage for that era. Weir says that even during strikes, lower-paid workers would tend to focus discontent on individual employers rather than on the capitalist system itself. The dynamics of the granite industry, including horrendous working conditions, the decentralized nature of the industry, combined with radical traditions from Europe, tended to reinforce anarchist traditions rooted in the individualism of artisans and small producers over that of broader working class-oriented socialism. An article in the Vermont Digger, then again A Voice for Change by Mark Bushnell, says about Barre, at the turn of the last century, sections of the city were consumed with anarchism. Groups of Italian anarchists also existed in the nearby towns of Montpelier, Northfield, and Hardwick, although Barre had the largest anarchist community. Barre's anarchists were characterized by lively debates and fierce polemics. Emma Goldman. The anarchist Emma Goldman made several highly tumultuous trips to Barre. Her first trip was January of 1899 and was to be part of a 9-month, 11-state speaking tour. Her first visit started off well. The Barre Evening Telegram announced she would be speaking on social problems and called Goldman the well-known lecturer and friend of the people. And this favorable announcement was echoed by Barre's 6 Italian-language papers. She stayed with Salvatore Pallavicini an anarchist activist whom she had worked with during a textile strike. She also visited Luigi Galleani, a highly controversial insurrectionary anarchist. Beginning January 23rd, Goldman spoke on women's rights and the need to broaden opportunities for women at Barre's Tamassi Hall. According to reporters, she spoke at a packed hall with between 40 and 50 women present among a crowd of mostly male workers. This speech, while progressive for the time, was relatively uncontroversial. A reporter for the Telegram said that Goldman gave a very interesting discourse, speaking eloquently in defense of her sister women. Goldman's lecture a few days later, however, was much more controversial, although it isn't really known what she said. According to some accounts, she had said, "God bless the hand that blew up the Maine," referring to the U.S. Navy ship that had blown up in Havana Harbor the previous year, killing 260 people, although she herself hotly denied saying this. Before she could make her third scheduled speech at Tamassi Hall, a large crowd of people, according to some accounts verging on a mob, gathered in front of the hall, determined to prevent her from speaking. There was a threat to cut the electrical cables, leaving the hall in darkness if she spoke. Anarchists came in a show of counterforce, and according to a contemporary newspaper account, everybody was, quote, armed to the teeth, and some of the anarchists of Barre were ready to make their presence felt. The town sheriff and his deputies surrounded the hall and closed down the event. Goldman subsequently left Vermont for Chicago, the next stop on her lecture tour. The Montpelier Telegram said, quote, "If the woman keeps away from Barre or stops talking, no one is likely to make trouble for her," making an implicit threat. Unlike her earlier speeches, a transcript of this canceled speech exists, which ironically was about how authority restricts freedom. While Goldman could not deliver her speech, Barre anarchists printed 5,000 copies of it and over the next several days widely distributed them throughout town. In her abortive speech, Goldman said she wasn't attacking society as such, but the state and its laws, which she thought was oppressive and hypocritical. She emphasized how government works on behalf of the rich while waging gruesome wars and subjecting the poor to imprisonment and the death penalty. In her autobiography, Goldman later said that her friend from Barre had told her that the police pressured her to leave town, not because of hostility from townspeople after her radical speech, but because in one incident she had caught Barre's mayor and chief of police dead drunk and had knowledge of their stakes in the local prostitution racket. Sounds plausible, but Weir, however, says that story doesn't seem likely, stating that although Vermont had been a, quote, dry state since 1854, when the state enacted its own version of prohibition, this was widely ignored by many towns in Vermont, and Barre residents would not have been at all surprised to see town officials drunk. In December of the year after Goldman's first appearance in Barre, stemming from long simmering tensions between Barre's anarchists and the police, Barre Police Chief Patrick Brown was ambushed by 6 anarchists and shot. He survived the attack, and at least one Barre anarchist was convicted in the shooting. The Vermont State's Attorney tried to charge Goldman as an accessory, claiming that she had yelled threats against the police from her departing train. A grand jury, though, found the charge unconvincing and refused to indict her. Brown was actually the same chief of police whom it was claimed Goldman saw drunk in 1899. In 1902, after a mentally ill man, Leon Zogglitz, who had allegedly been a follower of Emma Goldman, assassinated President McKinley, the Montpelier Evening Telegram called for the assassin to be hung and hinted at a similar punishment for Goldman, saying, "Perhaps it would seem a little barbarous to lynch a woman, but Emma Goldman certainly deserves something severe in the way of punishment." Goldman hotly denied having any connection with Zogglitz or the assassination. Besides the intense hostility against her, Goldman visited Barre a couple more further occasions in 1907 and 1911. These appearances do not appear to have been as inflammatory as her first appearance, though. Luigi Galleani. A major figure in the Italian-American anarchist movement and Barre resident was Luigi Galleani, lived between 1861 and 1919. Between 1914 and 1932, his followers carried out a series of bombings against institutions regarded as pillars of U.S. capitalism. While misguided and counterproductive, it's important to keep in mind that This was a highly corrupt, violence-prone era when strikes in general were subjected to routine police violence, and National Guard or private armies carried out massacres of striking workers at places like Ludlow, Colorado, and Homestead, Pennsylvania, the famous Homestead Steel Strike. The capitalist system itself was seen as a violent enemy of working people. Born in Vercelli in the Granite region, northern Italy, Galleani became an anarchist while studying at the University of Turin. Wanted by Italian police for his anarchist activism, Galleani fled to France, where he remained for 20 years. He spent time in Switzerland, where he collaborated in research and activism with the famous anarchist geographer Reclus. In 1887, Galleani organized a student demonstration in honor of the Chicago Haymarket martyrs, who were executed that year. For his involvement in this, Galleani was arrested and deported from Switzerland, after which he returned to France. Galleani then returned to Italy, where he was found guilty of conspiracy and spent more than 5 years in prison in, quote, internal exile on the island of Pantelleria off the coast of Sicily. Escaping from Pantelleria in 1900, Galleani then fled to Egypt, which then had a large Italian expatriate community, and he hid among Italian anarchists there. A few months later, he made it to London and then immigrated to the U.S. in 1901. Galleani arrived in the U.S. at the age of 40. He initially settled in Paterson, New Jersey, which was then a center of Italian-American anarchism. In an article in the Barre, Montpelier Times-Argus, mentions how Galleani became the, quote, de facto intellectual leader of American anarchism in an era when anarchism was close to being a mass movement. Galleani emerged as a skilled orator with a brilliant intellect and was a fierce anti-capitalist. An article appearing in Infogalactic quotes a brother of a Galleanist bomb maker saying, quote, "You heard Galleani speak and you were ready to shoot the first policeman you saw." In 1902, while making a speech to striking Paterson silk workers advocating a general strike and the overthrow of capitalism, the police began firing on striking workers and Galleani was shot in the face. Indicted for inciting a riot, Galleani fled to Canada, where the Border Patrol then escorted him back over the U.S. border. Galleani then settled in Barre, where he became a major figure among Italian anarchists there. In Barre, he gave fire-breathing speeches condemning capitalism and the timidity of rival socialists. Galleani was a prolific writer and founded the famous anarchist weekly Chronica Subversiva, Subversive Chronicle, in 1903, which he published and mailed from offices in Barre for 19 of its 15 years of existence. While Galleani acted as the editor and major contributor to the paper, his name did not appear on the masthead due to the fact that he was a fugitive. Instead, the well-known Barre sculptor and teacher Carlo Abate was used as a figurehead. While Abate contributed his artwork, there is no evidence he ever wrote for the paper himself. Abate was a visionary artist, later known for carving mainstream busts of Thomas Edison and Shirley Temple, but who was known to have a strong interest in social justice. At its height, Chronica Subversiva had 5,000 subscribers and had subscribers throughout the Italian immigrant diaspora in the US, Europe, South America, and Australia. The paper had articles advocating free love, opposing organized religion and belief in God, denouncing state tyranny, as well as extolling the propaganda of the deed, acts of violence designed to trigger a working-class uprising, and emphasized the importance of armed resistance to the state. The paper praised the assassination of figures such as President McKinley and King Uberto of Italy, and personal information about strike-breaking business owners and others regarded as class enemies. Several books were written expanding on Galleani's articles in Chronica Subversiva, including Analiti e Singuti, Modigliani, Size and Sob's Portraits, which celebrated the lives of bombers and anarchists, bombers and assassins as anarchist heroes. Later issues of Chronica Subversiva advertised a booklet, La Salute è in voi, Health is in You, a bomb-making manual, kind of an early 20th century version of the Anarchist Cookbook, although I used to have a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook and it's actually not that good. Chronica Subversiva was published from its offices in Blackwell Street in Barre, and then the annual May Day, Primo Maggio, their masthead was changed to depict portraits of the martyrs of Haymarket. Honoring May Day was, it has been said, very likely to have been one of the few things on which the socialist and anarchist of Barre agreed. in his paper Anarchist-Socialist Disputes. In his paper, Galleani continued a long rivalry dating back to Italy with the socialist Giacinto Cerati, who was then editor of the popular New York City-based Socialist Labor Party Italian language paper Il Proletario. A fierce polemical battle developed between the two anti-capitalist activists, with Cerati advocating a moderate approach to political activism, and Galleani favoring confrontational, direct action. The two began attacking each other in print. The building of the Socialist Labor Party Hall in 1900, intended as a meeting place for unions and as a center for the Italian workers' movement in Barre, with its hall seating hundreds, was regarded as having given the socialists an unfair advantage, and was regarded by Barre's anarchists as a provocation. Tensions in Barre were further inflamed by the polemics between Galleani and Cerati in their respective papers, both widely read in Barre. In 1903, Barre activists invited Cerati to speak at the Labor Hall. By this time, tensions between anarchists and socialists were at a boiling point. Cerati was to give a talk on methods of socialist struggle. As Cerati arrived, the Labor Hall was surrounded by angry anarchists, and Cerati had to struggle through the crowd. He was scheduled to speak at 7 p.m., but his entry was delayed. People thought his appearance had been canceled due to fears for his safety. The Labor Hall itself was packed with a hostile anarchist crowd. Anarchists began taunts about Cerati's non-appearance. A fight broke out before Cerati could mount the podium. Shouts and taunts led to scuffles, and someone pulled out a knife and someone else threw a chair. This quickly turned to a full-scale brawl. It was later claimed that anarchists had shouted, "Kill the socialists." At one point, a 39-year-old socialist, Alessandro Garetto, who had been carrying a pistol, joined the fight. He shot at least twice, one shot grazing an anarchist, and the other hitting Ilea Corti, regarded as Barre's finest sculptor, in the stomach. Garetto was then thrown down the stairs of the hall and fled, running down Granite Street. Fearing he might be lynched by angry anarchists, he turned himself into a judge, who then turned him over to the police. Police Chief Brown, same guy who had been attacked by anarchists a few years before, put Garetto in a wagon to be transported to the jail in nearby Montpelier. On the way, the wagon stopped to pick up an injured patient who needed emergency care at a nearby hospital. And, by a strange coincidence, the patient turned out to be Elias Corti. Chief Brown held up a lantern so Corti could see Garetto's face. "You are the man who shot me," he said, twice. At this point, Corti's colleague, the sculptor Samuel Novelli, who had accompanied him in the wagon, became very angry and tried to throw the lantern at Garetto, but it hit the police chief instead. Novelli then tried to take the chief's revolver. Police were able to subdue Novelli and pull him out of the wagon. The bullet passing through Elias Corti's stomach had lodged near his spine, and with the medical technology of the day was impossible to remove. Corti died after 30 hours at the hospital, and at his request was buried the next day at Barre's Hope Cemetery, with hundreds of people attending his funeral. Corti's death sent shockwaves through Barre and led to a temporary truce between anarchists and socialists. Corti was 34 years old at the time of the shooting. He had immigrated from Italy 12 years before this incident, and a few years before the shooting in 1899, Corti and his partner Samuel Novelli had been commissioned by Barre's Scottish community to carve a statue of the beloved radical Scottish poet Robert Burns. Novelli carved the likeness of Burns while Corti did the more intricate facework. The statue is considered a masterpiece to this day and stands outside what was originally an elementary school and is now the Vermont Historical Society. After his death, Corti's brother and brother-in-law carved a striking monument to him, marking his grave. Corti is dressed in a dapper style in front of the tools of his trade. His hands rest on a broken column representing a life cut short. There is debate about what Corti was doing during the Labor Hall melee, and before his marriage he had been an active anarchist, respected in anarchist circles, and was the founder of an anarchist cell. After his marriage and as his own sculpting business took off, Corti became less politically active. According to some accounts, he had agreed to attend Cerati's talk out of a desire to keep his younger brother and two brothers-in-law out of trouble. Witnesses said that he had waved his hands appealing for calm when the fighting broke out. Vilification between Galleani and Cerati continued for the next several years. In 1906, Il Proletario divulged Galtieri's name and whereabouts blowing his cover, although Cerati later claimed this had been an accident. New Jersey officials had an extradition order for Galleani for his alleged role in inciting a riot during the Patterson strike of 1902. Shortly after his identity had been revealed, the Washington County Sheriff arrested Galleani, who calmly surrendered at his home. Galleani said goodbye to his wife and children and spent that night in the local jail. The next day, several hundred of his supporters arrived at the train depot in Montpelier to show their support. The day after that, hundreds of people again protested in Barre's Depot Square against Galleani's extradition. Despite mounting protests, Vermont Governor Proctor signed an extradition order for Galleani to be sent to New Jersey. However, to the surprise of a lot of people, Galleani's trial led to a hung jury, and Galleani was released and actually later returned to Barre. On his return to Barre, Emma Goldman, on her second visit to the town herself, welcomed Galleani back, and they jointly spoke at the Barre Opera House to a standing room only audience of more than 900, with Goldman speaking in English and Galleani speaking in Italian. In 1905, there was a suspicious fire at the Blackwell Street offices of Chronica Subversive, although the printing presses weren't affected and the paper was able to continue publication. There were suspicions that the U.S. government had been involved, although nothing was ever proven. In 1912, Galleani, due to conflicts within the Barre anarchist community, moved Chronica Subversive to Lynn, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. During World War I, Chronica Subversive took a strong anti-war stance, opposing U.S. entry into the war. Galleani advised his followers of the U.S. not to register for the draft and to move to Mexico to avoid it. Identified as a, quote, resident alien, who advocated the violent overthrow of the U.S. government and who wrote a bomb-making manual, the U.S. government deported Galleani and 8 of his followers to Italy in June of 1919 as part of a wave of deportations of foreign-born U.S. radicals. As a counterattack against this, Galleani's followers began a bombing campaign against people and institutions regarded as pillars of capitalism in and around New York City, including the house of John D. Rockefeller, the Tombs New York City Prison Police Court, and St. Patrick's Cathedral. The 1920 Wall Street bombing, which killed 30 people, was believed to have been carried out by Galleani. This in turn led to the repressive Palmer raids, a crackdown against leftist, native, and foreign-born alike, in which over 10,000 people were arrested and many deported. Chronica Subversive was briefly reestablished in Italy after Galleani had been deported. After Mussolini came to power in 1922, Galleani was arrested and was again exiled to the island of Pantelleria. He died in 1931. The fascist government had him buried at night to prevent a rally by his followers. Galleani's socialist rival, Cerati, also returned to Italy and played a prominent role as leader of the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party, the PSI, and edited its paper, Avanti. He later joined the Italian Communist Party, PCI, but he broke with them over the Comintern's demand to break with the left wing of the PSI. Despite the incendiary polemics of Galleani and the fighting and shooting at the Labor Hall, Barre's anarchists were known to be peaceful and were regarded as good citizens. A local newspaper, the Barre Daily Times, said that local anarchists were good citizens and that they were peaceful, honest men who minded their own business, paid their bills, and have no desire to trouble anyone, and whose children are among the brightest scholars in our public schools. Barre's anarchists were not involved in Barre's anarchist politics and did not appear to have influenced the mainstream union movement to any large degree. Okay, the Socialist Labor Party Hall. The socialist movement in Barre took on a less confrontational and more peaceful approach. The first nationally organized based socialist organization in Barre was the Socialist Labor Party, the SLP. It appears that it was centered in the Radical Quarry Workers International Union of North America. This union, working with other groups, organized Barre's Italian community in building the Socialist Labor Party Hall in 1900 at 46 Granite Street, a block off Barre's Main Street and then known as a rough area, surrounded by granite sheds and tenements. The Labor Hall was built for $7,000, a lot of money back then. It was in use from 1900 to 1935 as a meeting and function hall and organizing and social space. Meetings of the SLP and the Socialist Party, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, and granite workers' unions were held there, as well as boxing and wrestling matches, fundraising events for strikes and workers' relief, centers for local organizing, drives in stores and bakeries, and parties and celebrations. Workers' insurance societies were headquartered there, and state conventions for the Vermont Socialist Party were held there. And despite the tensions between socialists and anarchists, Barre's anarchists used the hall as well. Hall also had a speakeasy, which was used during Prohibition. Premio Maggio, or May Day celebrations in honor of the Haymarket martyrs, were held at the hall and were a combination of festive and serious. There was some conflict before the hall officially opened. The Granite Cutters International Union, CGNU, had agreed to rent the hall, but had backed out 2 weeks before the scheduled opening because of an accusation that the building had been built with scab or at least non-union labor. The contractor hired to build the hall strongly denied the charge of hiring scabs, and after investigation, the GCNU moved into the hall, which was opened November 28, 1900, amid a big celebration. On the opening day, Camillo Cianfaro, then editor of Il Proletario, gave a lecture on what is socialism to a standing room-only audience of about 700. This was followed by dancing until early the next morning. 9 days after the opening, the emblem of the hall containing the SLP's arm and hammer symbol was completed by the sculptor Egidio Dungi and was ready to be installed on the hall's front door, where it still is today. Prominent figures in U.S. socialist, labor, and anti-capitalist movements spoke at the hall. This included IWW leader Big Bill Haywood, who spoke there in 1909, and Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, who appeared during his presidential campaigns of 1904, 1908, and 1912. Arturo Giovannitti, an IWW leader who played a role in the famous Lowell Bread and Roses strike of 1912, attended events at the Labor Hall. In 1914, IWW organizer Mary Harris, commonly known as Mother Jones, came to Barre in the midst of a severe snowstorm to speak in support of a strike by Barre's retail sales workers. In 1934, the fiery communist Anne Burlock, known as the Red Flame for her dramatic speeches, spoke at the hall. The Barre Daily Times described her speech as advising workers to avoid strike arbitration, which she regarded as a means of seducing workers from their struggle, and to mistrust small groups of labor leaders. In 1901, a cooperative store was opened in the basement of the Labor Hall, which sold Italian groceries and dry goods. Sometime later, the store opened a bakery and bought a bottling plant. The store issued its own currency with the SLP Arm & Hammer logo. After a severe flood in 1913 and in answer to increased demand, the co-op bought a second bakery behind the hall, and the co-op also opened a laundry and a branch store in nearby Northfield. Some of the profits from these businesses were used to subsidize membership for those who otherwise couldn't afford it, co-op membership, help for people in difficulty, funds for Italian earthquake relief, and support for an Italian-American mutual aid society, the Società del Mutuo Soccorso, which provided help for families devastated by silicosis. During the 1912 Bread and Roses strike in Lowell, Massachusetts, Barre's radicals expressed strong solidarity with striking workers. After mill owners in Lowell announced a massive pay cut in mid-January, a wildcat strike erupted with up to 10,000 workers leaving the mills. News of this quickly reached Barre. At a mass meeting in the Labor Hall, 350 people unanimously voted in favor of a resolution supporting the Lowell strike. After months of threats from the late mill owners, escalating tension, and the death of one worker, Anna Lopozzo, Lowell strikers decided to send their children out of Lowell for safety. In this children's exodus, children were sent to sympathizing families in places throughout the Northeast, including Barre. In mid-February, a parade of several hundred sympathizers met 35 Lowell children. The group then marched to the Barre Town Hall and back, and the children were brought to the Labor Hall. The marchers were accompanied by a band made up of sympathizers from Barre, Waterbury, and Bethel, nearby towns. The Labor Hall, the children were examined by doctors and were given new coats and ID tags, and were presented with a huge banquet before their local host families took them home. Photos of the children were taken, made into postcards that were sent to their parents. While in Barre, the children attended the local schools, and by the middle of March, some of the Lowell children had been sent home, and the last of the 35 children were sent home by the end of the month. The Labor Hall and its enterprises were hard hit by the flood of 1927. although it managed a recovery. The cooperative society which owned the hall was forced to sell in 1936 during the Great Depression. For the next 60 years, the Labor Hall had been used as a warehouse, used at various times to store food, coal, and for a time was used as a bottling plant. The last commercial owner of the hall was Vermont Pack Tomato, which filed for bankruptcy in 1994. The Labor Hall was then bought by the Barre Historical Society, and with support from local unions, the hall was repaired and renovated. Unfortunately, due to a bank not honoring its promises, many boxes of papers relating to Barre history were sent to a dump before historians could look at them. The Labor Hall held a grand reopening celebration on September 2nd, 2000. The Labor Hall today is used as the headquarters of the Barre Historical Society and several local unions. Decline. Despite Niccolò Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Italian-American anarchists whose trial for murder continued throughout the 1920s and were facing a death sentence, received strong support in Barre, anarchism began to fade in the town after World War I with greater mechanization and centralization of the granite industry and larger firms pushing out smaller firms out of which the anarchist movement had come. The post-World War I wave of repression and the deportation of foreign radicals took a toll on both Barre's anarchist and socialist movements. Fierce labor battles, however, continued during the 1920s and 1930s. In the early 1920s, Barre business owners teamed up to impose the anti-union American Plan, which would deny union recognition on the pretext of fighting Bolshevism. In 1933, the governor of Vermont, in a highly controversial move, mobilized the National Guard to settle a strike. At times, French-Canadian workers were brought to Barre to act as scabs. Although this occurred somewhat after the time period covered, socialists achieved some electoral success during and after World War I, when Barre had two socialist mayors, Robert Gordon and Fred Suter. Robert Gordon was an immigrant from Scotland who came to Barre as part of the first wave of Scottish stonecutters to arrive, and in Barre he was heavily involved in the downtown Scottish community. Robert Weir's Solid Men in the Grand City describes how Barre's business elites long controlled the town's politics through use of a, quote, citizens caucus, in which Democratic and Republican politicians united to keep Barre socialists from the Socialist Party, the Socialist Labor Party, and the Quarry Workers International Union divided and marginalized. Gordon first ran for mayor in 1912, but narrowly lost due to opposition from the Stonecutters Union, who had endorsed their own candidates. Gordon, who had a background in union organizing, was able to make an end run around the employer's political monopoly and appealed to a broader range of voters by posing as a socialist moderate against the more radical SLP and Barre's anarchists, and was elected mayor in 1914. Gordon was a classic sewer socialist, as he made important reforms, municipalized the city's coal distribution, greatly improved Barre's road building and repair, and worked for the financial responsibility of Barre's Central Power Company. Although the socialist movement in Vermont had largely been crushed during the post-World War I Repression, Greg Goldman, History of Class Struggle in Vermont, From Socialism to the American Plan, published on thefringe.com, described how John Lawson, another immigrant from Scotland, who had arrived with his parents and who had attended socialist meetings at the Labor Hall as a teenager, rebuilt the Vermont Socialist Party after World War I during a difficult time for the left. Fred Suter was a protege of Robert Gordon and was born in Quebec in 1879. Suter had a background in union activism and was the secretary of the Quarry Workers International Union. He was elected mayor on the Citizens Caucus ticket after more leftist elements came to prominence in that party. After other leftist elements came to prominence in that party instead of the Socialist Party, and served in that role between 1929 and 1931. Unlike Gordon, Suter improved and Suter improved and expanded the town's municipal services, but his programs were hard hit by the Great Depression. Both mayors were far from revolutionaries. In Solid Men in the Grand City, Robert Weir says that cheap coal, water lines, sidewalks, paved roads, playgrounds, and balanced budgets are hardly the future imagined by socialist theorists. Weir quotes Milwaukee socialist Daniel Hohen, who in 1940 declared his own 24-year mayoralty of Milwaukee to have been a complete fizzle, and quote, having socialized only a stone quarry and the city's streetlights, and discussing the challenges of being a socialist within a hegemonic capitalist society. Perhaps showing the support for socialists of perhaps showing the importance for socialists of combining shorter-term reforms with a vision of revolutionary transformation of society and the usefulness of the Trotskyist transitional program. The reality was that Barre's fading radicalism had moved far away from its earlier Italian-American heyday. Thank you.
Prona la fronte sotto il peso del lavoro, piegato il cor dallo scudiscio del potente, purché la gioia dia chi vive nell'oro, senza di mani il lavorator morente, siamo nel dolore d'una schiavitù tirata.